Man's false allegations of infidelity against black wife lead to shocking reunion with her and triplets 5 years later. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Get ready for another beautiful tale that will spark your imagination and warm your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a magical story. Let's dive in. The Washington Business Summit transformed the city's Grand Meridian Hotel into a buzzing hive of corporate excellence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany-paneled walls of the Grand Ballroom, where hundreds of the nation's most influential business leaders gathered for the annual conference. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and even more expensive ambitions. Bernard Ellison, at 35, commanded respect wherever he went. His presence was impossible to ignore. 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, always draped in impeccably tailored suits. Today's being a deep charcoal Tom Ford that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His features were sharp and distinguished. High cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with carefully maintained stubble, and eyes the color of aged whiskey that seemed to look straight through people's pretenses. Time had been kind to him, sprinkling just enough silver at his temples to lend him an air of distinguished maturity without diminishing his youthful vigor. As CEO of Ellison Enterprises, one of the country's fastest-growing technology conglomerates, Bernard was used to being the center of attention. Yet today, as chief guest of the summit, he found himself unusually restless. He'd sat through countless presentations, each blending into the next, a parade of PowerPoint slides and rehearsed speeches that failed to capture his interest. Checking his Patek Philippe watch for what felt like the 100th time, he calculated how much longer he needed to maintain his polite facade. "Next up," announced the moderator, her voice carrying through the state-of-the-art sound system, "we have Kalantha Ione, marketing manager from Tech Vision Solutions, presenting their revolutionary approach to sustainable technology marketing." Bernard's attention drifted to his phone, expecting another forgettable presentation. But the voice that filled the room seconds later made him look up, and once he did, he couldn't look away. Kalantha Ione stood at the podium, and she was unlike anyone Bernard had ever seen in his years of corporate leadership. At 21, she was remarkably young for her position, but it was more than that. She commanded the stage with a presence that belied her age. Her dark skin glowed under the warm lights, smooth as polished mahogany, and her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo that spoke of both professionalism and cultural pride. She wore a tailored royal blue dress that hit just below her knees, its clean lines emphasizing her graceful figure without being provocative. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught Bernard's attention. It was her voice, rich and confident, carrying complex ideas with the ease of someone who truly understood their subject matter. Her hands moved with purpose as she spoke, painting pictures in the air of future possibilities. "In an age where technology evolves faster than consumer trust," she began, her words clear and measured, "we need to revolutionize not just what we sell, but how we connect with our audience. The future of sustainable technology lies not in overwhelming consumers with features, but in showing them how our innovations can seamlessly integrate into their lives while protecting the world they love." Bernard found himself leaning forward in his chair, something he hadn't done all day. As Kalantha moved through her presentation, she didn't just share data, she told a story. Her slides were minimal, serving only to enhance her narrative rather than carry it. She spoke of market trends with the insight of someone twice her age, yet brought fresh perspectives that made even Bernard, with all his experience, see things differently. "We've found that 78% of consumers under 35 are willing to pay premium prices for technology that demonstrably reduces their carbon footprint," she continued, gesturing to a simple but effective graph. But here's what's fascinating. It's not the environmental impact alone that drives purchases. It's the intersection of personal benefit and global responsibility. When we market sustainable technology, we're not just selling products. We're offering people the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. The usual shuffling and whispered conversations that plagued most presentations were notably absent. The room was caught in her spell, and Bernard realized he hadn't checked his phone or his watch once since she began speaking. He watched as she handled the Q&A session with grace and quick wit, never once faltering even when faced with challenging questions from industry veterans. As applause erupted at the conclusion of her presentation, Bernard found himself standing, something he rarely did at these events. The movement caught the attention of several nearby attendees, their eyebrows raising at this unprecedented show of approval from the notoriously hard-to-impress CEO. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Bernard made his way to the stage as Calantha was gathering her materials. She looked up as he approached, and he was struck by her eyes, deep brown with flecks of gold, intelligent and warm. "Exceptional presentation, Ms. Ione," he said, extending his hand. Her handshake was firm and professional, her hand small but warm in his. "I'd like to discuss some of your ideas in more detail. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow?" Calantha's smile was genuine but measured. "Thank you, Mr. Ellison. I'm honored by your interest." She paused, pulling out her phone to check her schedule. "I have a morning flight back to Chicago, but I could rearrange it if you think the meeting would be valuable." Bernard found himself admiring her poise. She wasn't jumping at his invitation like many would have, but considering it professionally. "I assure you, Ms. Ione, it would be very valuable. Ellison Enterprises is looking to revolutionize our approach to sustainable technology marketing, and your insights today were enlightening." A small group had gathered nearby, trying to appear casual, while obviously eavesdropping on this interaction between the CEO and the young presenter. Calantha seemed to notice but remained unfazed. "In that case, Mr. Ellison, I would be happy to meet. Shall we say 9 a.m. at your offices?" "Actually," Bernard heard himself say, "I know a quiet cafe near here, Magnolia and Vine. Much better for a genuine conversation than a corporate office. Would that suit you?" Something flickered in Calantha's eyes, surprise, perhaps curiosity. "That would be fine," she agreed, her professional smile warming slightly. "I appreciate the consideration for a more casual setting." As they exchanged contact information, Bernard felt an unfamiliar flutter in his chest. He'd conducted thousands of business meetings, but something told him tomorrow's would be different. There was an energy around Calantha Ione that intrigued him. A combination of youthful enthusiasm and old-soul wisdom that he found compelling. Later that evening, in his penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, Bernard found himself rewatching clips of Calantha's presentation that someone had posted on the summit's private network. He told himself it was professional interest, that he was simply preparing for tomorrow's meeting. But as he drifted off to sleep, it wasn't her market analysis or sustainability strategies that played in his mind. It was her smile, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke, and the passionate light in her eyes when she talked about changing the world. What he didn't know then was that this day, this meeting, this moment of standing up and walking to the stage, it would change both their lives forever. In years to come, they would look back on this business summit as the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, but both had desperately needed. The Washington Business Summit had seen countless presentations, deals, and professional connections made over the years. But on this day, it witnessed something rarer, the first chapter of a love story that would challenge conventions, break hearts, heal wounds, and ultimately prove that true love knows no bounds of age, race, or social status. As the night settled over Washington, two people lay awake in different hotels, thinking about a chance meeting that felt somehow significant. Bernard Ellison, the man who had everything, discovered he might have found something he never knew he was missing, and Calantha Ione, the rising star with dreams bigger than her years, felt the first tremors of a future she never could have predicted. Tomorrow would bring coffee and conversation, the first of many meetings that would gradually blur the lines between professional and personal. But for now, they existed in that magical space of possibility, where everything was potential and nothing was yet complicated by reality. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel stood empty now, the lights dimmed, the chairs neatly arranged for tomorrow's sessions. But the air still hummed with the energy of what had transpired, a seemingly ordinary business presentation that had set in motion an extraordinary journey of love, loss, redemption, and the courage to believe in second chances. In the quiet of the night, as Washington's power players slept and dreamed of their next big deals, something more precious than any business venture was taking root, a connection that would prove stronger than pride, more valuable than any corporate merger, and more enduring than either of them could imagine. On this night, when everything began. Chapter 2. A Whirlwind Romance. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the polished wood tables of Magnolia and Vine, an elegant cafe tucked away in a historic Georgetown brownstone. Bernard arrived 15 minutes early, something he never did for business meetings. He chose a quiet corner table beneath a sprawling fiddle-leaf fig tree, its leaves casting delicate shadows on the cream-colored walls. The cafe's owner, Marie, approached with a knowing smile. She'd known Bernard for years. He often came here to escape the corporate world's constant demands. "Your usual, Mr. Ellison?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes, but I'm expecting someone," he replied, straightening his steel blue tie for the third time since sitting down. He'd chosen his outfit with unusual care that morning, a light grey Tom Ford suit that softened his usually imposing presence. At precisely 9 a.m., the cafe's bell chimed. Calantha entered, wearing a cream silk blouse tucked into high-waisted burgundy pants, her natural hair arranged in elegant twists. She carried herself with that same quiet confidence from yesterday's presentation, but there was something softer about her in the morning light. Bernard stood as she approached, pulling out her chair. "Ms. Ione, thank you for joining me." "Please call me Calantha," she smiled, setting down her leather portfolio. "This is lovely," she added, looking around the cafe. "I wouldn't have expected to find such a hidden gem in Georgetown." Marie returned with Bernard's usual, a double espresso, and took Calantha's order. "Lavender honey latte, please, and do you have any pastries that aren't too sweet?" "Our orange rosemary scones just came out of the oven," Marie suggested. "Perfect." Calantha nodded, and Bernard noticed how she engaged with Marie, warm, genuine, treating her with the same respect she'd shown to the corporate executives yesterday. What was meant to be a business meeting quickly evolved into something else entirely. They began with marketing strategies and sustainable technology, but soon found themselves discussing everything from classical literature to jazz, their coffee growing cold as they lost themselves in conversation. "Wait!" Calantha laughed, her eyes sparkling. "You're telling me you've never read Toni Morrison?" Bernard shook his head, enjoying the way her face lit up with playful disapproval. "I'm more of a Hemingway man myself." "Oh, we need to fix that immediately," she declared, pulling out her phone and creating a reading list. "Start with Beloved. It'll change your life." Hours slipped by unnoticed. They ordered second cups of coffee, then lunch. Bernard found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, about growing up as the son of a demanding father, about the loneliness at the top of the corporate ladder. Calantha spoke of her childhood in Chicago's South Side, of a mother who worked 3 jobs to put her through college, of dreams bigger than anyone thought possible for a young black girl from her neighborhood. "I was the first in my family to go to college," she said, absently stirring her 3rd cup of coffee. "My mother, she used to get up at 4 a.m. to work at the diner, then did administrative work during the day and cleaned offices at night. She'd still help me with my homework between shifts." Bernard leaned forward, captivated by the mix of pride and determination in her voice. "She must be incredibly proud of you now." A shadow crossed Calantha's face. "She passed away during my senior year of college. Cancer. But she got to see me get my internship at Tech Vision. She always said she knew I'd make it." Without thinking, Bernard reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent an electric current through both of them. For a moment, neither moved, both acutely aware of this first point of contact between them. Calantha slowly withdrew her hand, but her eyes held his. "I should probably get going," she said softly. "I need to book a new flight back to Chicago." "Have dinner with me tonight," Bernard said, surprising himself with the urgency in his voice. "There's this amazing Ethiopian restaurant in Adams Morgan, unless you don't like Ethiopian food." A small smile played at her lips. "I love Ethiopian food, but Mr. Ellison—" "Bernard," he interrupted, "please." "Bernard," she corrected, "are you sure this is appropriate? I mean, you're one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, and I'm just starting my career." "Right now," he said, "I'm just a man asking a brilliant woman to have dinner with him. Nothing more, nothing less." The evening found them at Churcher Ethiopian restaurant, sitting close on comfortable cushions, sharing dishes and stories. Bernard watched in admiration as Calantha expertly tore pieces of injera bread, explaining how her college roommate had been Ethiopian and had taught her the proper way to eat with her hands. "You're full of surprises," he said, watching her confidently navigate the dishes. "Says the tech mogul who quotes Pablo Neruda," she countered, referring to their earlier conversation about poetry. Their dinner stretched into a walk through the city, neither wanting the evening to end. The Washington Monument stood illuminated against the night sky as they strolled along the National Mall. "Tell me something true," Calantha said suddenly, stopping to face him. "Something you've never told anyone else." Bernard was quiet for a moment, looking out over the reflecting pool. "I'm terrified of failing," he finally said. "Not in business. I know how to handle that. But at being real, being genuine. Everyone wants something from me, expects something from me. It's been so long since I felt like I could just be myself." Calantha studied him, her expression thoughtful. "And who is yourself, Bernard Ellison?" "I'm starting to remember," he said softly, looking at her. "Today, with you, I'm starting to remember." That night marked the beginning of what the media would later call a whirlwind romance. Though to Bernard and Calantha, it felt more like finally finding solid ground. Over the next few months, they created their own rhythm. Bernard flew to Chicago every weekend, discovering the city through Calantha's eyes. Small jazz clubs in Bronzeville, hidden bookstores in Hyde Park, the best deep-dish pizza places that tourists never found. Calantha introduced him to her world, to soul food Sundays with her aunts, to poetry slams in dimly lit venues, to the reality of being young and black in America. Bernard's eyes were opened to experiences and perspectives he'd never considered, and he found himself falling not just for Calantha, but for the richness of her culture and community. In return, Bernard showed Calantha the world. Weekend trips to Paris for art exhibitions, impromptu flights to New York for Broadway shows, quiet retreats to his cabin in the Berkshires where they spent hours reading to each other by the fireplace. Their differences in age and background became their strength. Calantha's youth and idealism balanced Bernard's experience and pragmatism. Her authenticity helped him shed the corporate armor he'd worn for so long, while his stability gave her the freedom to dream even bigger. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. They faced raised eyebrows and whispered comments about their age difference, their racial difference, their different social backgrounds. Some of Bernard's board members made thinly veiled suggestions about appropriate relationships. Calantha's friends worried she was being naive, falling for a man who could easily replace her with someone more suitable for his social circle. The turning point came 6 months into their relationship at a charity gala in New York. Bernard had been distant all evening, and Calantha finally cornered him on a deserted balcony. "Talk to me," she demanded. "What's wrong?" Bernard ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty. "I overheard some comments tonight about us, about you, the things they were saying." "And since when does Bernard Ellison care what others think?" she challenged, stepping closer to him. "I care what they think about you," he said fiercely. "I can handle anything they say about me, but you deserve better than their judgment and prejudice." Calantha took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "I don't need you to protect me from their words. I've dealt with prejudice my whole life. What I need is for you to stand beside me, to face it together. Can you do that?" In response, Bernard pulled her close and kissed her deeply, not caring who might see. When they broke apart, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks," he admitted, "trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words, but maybe there are no perfect moments, just perfect truths. And the truth is, Calantha Ione, you make me better, you make me braver, you make me real. Will you marry me?" The ring was stunning but understated, a vintage Art Deco piece with a center diamond surrounded by sapphires. But more stunning was the look in Calantha's eyes as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. Their engagement made headlines across the country. Tech mogul to wed rising star, and modern fairy tale, love crosses age and race barriers. But Bernard and Calantha barely noticed the media frenzy. They were too busy planning their future, designing a life that would combine both their worlds. They decided to split their time between Chicago and Washington, maintaining their connections to both communities. Bernard began investing in tech education programs in underserved communities, while Calantha continued her meteoric rise in the marketing world, now working independently as a consultant. Their wedding plans reflected their shared vision, an intimate ceremony that honored both their backgrounds, followed by a reception that brought together corporate executives and community activists, jazz musicians and tech entrepreneurs, creating bridges between worlds that rarely intersected. As spring turned to summer and summer to fall, Bernard and Calantha built their life together, proving that love could indeed transcend all boundaries. Their story became a symbol of hope for others who dared to love across society's dividing lines. Little did they know that their greatest challenges and their greatest triumphs still lay ahead. But for now, in this chapter of their story, love was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 3. 3 years of bliss. The autumn wedding of Bernard Ellison and Calantha Ione was nothing short of magical. Held in the sprawling gardens of a historic estate outside Washington, D.C., it merged their two worlds seamlessly. The ceremony took place at sunset, with hundreds of lanterns illuminating the pathways and trees. Calantha wore a custom Vera Wang gown, its modern silhouette complemented by traditional African beadwork that honored her heritage. Bernard, seeing her walk down the aisle to the sounds of a string quartet playing Nina Simone's "Feeling Good," had tears in his eyes, a sight that made headlines in itself, as the famously composed CEO showed his emotional side. Their vows, written by themselves, spoke of bridges built and barriers broken, of love that dared to defy expectations. "You didn't just enter my world," Bernard had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You expanded it. You showed me colors I'd never seen, taught me songs I'd never heard, and gave me the courage to be vulnerable." Calantha's vows, equally moving, spoke of finding home in unexpected places. "You didn't try to change me to fit your world," she'd said. "Instead, you helped me build our own." The reception that followed was a celebration of their unique union. Soul food stations sat alongside gourmet French cuisine. A jazz quartet played, followed by a classical ensemble, and later a DJ had everyone, from corporate executives to Calantha's college friends, dancing together. It was exactly what they'd wanted, not just a wedding, but a testament to the power of love to unite different worlds. Their first year of marriage was a delicate dance of balancing their individual ambitions with their shared life. They settled into a stunning penthouse in Georgetown, which Calantha transformed from a stark modern space into a warm home that reflected both their tastes. African art hung beside modern photographs, vintage jazz albums shared shelf space with classical records, and the kitchen became a laboratory for fusion cooking as they experimented with combining their favorite cuisines. Bernard watched in pride as Calantha's consulting firm grew rapidly. She had a gift for helping traditional companies connect with younger, more diverse audiences, and her client list soon included some of the biggest names in tech and retail. He loved coming home to find her surrounded by papers and presentation boards, her hair pulled up in a messy bun, completely absorbed in her work. "You're staring," she'd say without looking up, a smile playing at her lips. "Can't help it," he'd reply, loosening his tie and joining her on the floor among her papers. "You're beautiful when you're in your element." Their different approaches to work complemented each other perfectly. Bernard's methodical, strategic thinking balanced Calantha's creative, intuitive style. They often bounced ideas off each other over morning coffee or late-night wine, their conversations spanning business strategy to social justice, technology to art. Their second year brought new adventures and deeper connections. They started a tradition of culture swap weekends, where they would take turns introducing each other to experiences from their backgrounds. Bernard took Calantha to her first opera, explaining the nuances of La Bohème in whispered comments that made her giggle. In return, she took him to his first step show at Howard University, watching his face light up with amazement at the precision and energy of the performances. They traveled extensively, but not just to the usual luxury destinations. Yes, they had romantic getaways in Paris and relaxing weeks in the Maldives, but they also spent time in Ghana, where Calantha connected with her roots, and in working-class Chicago neighborhoods where she'd grown up. Bernard found himself changed by these experiences, seeing the world through new eyes. Their third year brought them closer than ever as they faced their first real challenges together. Bernard's father fell ill, and Calantha proved to be an unexpected source of strength for both Bernard and his family. Despite the elder Ellison's initial reservations about their marriage, Calantha's gentle patience and genuine care won him over. She spent hours by his hospital bed, reading him jazz biographies and discussing the evolution of blues music, a passion they discovered they shared. "You know," his father had said to Bernard during his recovery, "that young woman of yours has an old soul. You chose well, son." That same year, Calantha's consulting firm faced a crisis when a major client tried to back out of a contract, claiming her approach was too progressive. Bernard watched proudly as she stood her ground, professionally but firmly defending her vision. When her strategy proved successful, doubling the client's engagement with under 30 consumers, it became a case study in modern marketing. They developed little rituals that became the foundation of their marriage. Every Sunday morning was sacred. No phones, no work, just them making breakfast together in their pajamas, dancing to old records. Bernard learned to make the perfect chai tea the way Calantha's mother used to make it, and he mastered his favorite French press coffee ritual. Their home became a gathering place for both their circles. Monthly dinner parties brought together diverse groups of friends and colleagues, creating connections that would never have existed otherwise. They hosted discussions about technology's impact on underserved communities, art's role in social change, and the future of inclusive business practices. The physical aspect of their relationship remained as passionate as ever. Despite their age difference, they found themselves perfectly matched in energy and desire. Their intimate moments were a celebration of their connection, tender sometimes, playful others, but always deeply loving. Bernard loved the way Calantha would trace the growing silver in his hair, calling them his wisdom highlights. She loved how his touch could still make her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. They supported each other's dreams fiercely. When Calantha decided to launch a mentorship program for young women of color in tech, Bernard not only provided initial funding, but actively participated, sharing his experiences and connections. When Bernard considered stepping back from day-to-day operations at Ellison Enterprises to focus on their philanthropic foundation, Calantha helped him see how he could do both, creating a better work-life balance. Their third anniversary was celebrated intimately, just the two of them at their cabin in the Berkshires. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Calantha in Bernard's arms, they reflected on their journey. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here?" she asked, playing with his wedding ring. "That day at the business summit, did you have any idea?" Bernard kissed her temple, inhaling the familiar scent of her coconut hair oil. "I knew you were special from the first moment, but this is better than anything I could have imagined." "Even with all the challenges?" she asked, thinking of the occasional negative press, the raised eyebrows, the assumptions they still sometimes faced. "Especially with the challenges," he replied. "They just prove how strong we are together." That evening they danced in their living room to John Coltrane's "In a Sentimental Mood," the same song they danced to at their wedding. Bernard held her close, marveling at how this talented, passionate young woman had changed his life so completely. Calantha rested her head on his chest, grateful for this man who had given her the space to grow while loving her unconditionally. Neither of them knew that their perfect world was about to face its greatest test, that the pressure of expectations, personal demons and unspoken fears would soon threaten everything they'd built. But in that moment, in their third year of marriage, they were simply and completely in love. Their union a testament to the power of looking beyond surfaces to see the truth in another's heart. Their story had become something of a modern fairy tale in Washington society, but those who knew them best saw something far more valuable: a genuine partnership built on respect, understanding, and the courage to love without boundaries. They had created their own definition of happiness, their own traditions, their own perfect blend of two different worlds. As they fell asleep that night, Bernard holding Calantha close, their breathing synchronized in the peaceful darkness, they were secure in their love, unaware that the greatest challenge to their happiness was looming on the horizon. But perhaps that's the nature of true love. It builds a foundation strong enough to weather any storm, even if we don't know the storm is coming. Chapter 4. The Fracture. The first signs of trouble appeared so subtly that Calantha almost missed them. It began with Bernard, lingering longer than usual when they visited their friends' children, with the way his eyes followed young families in the park, with small comments about their 5-bedroom penthouse feeling empty. As his 45th birthday approached, these hints grew more frequent, more pointed, until they could no longer be ignored. It was during a Sunday morning breakfast, their sacred time together, when the subject finally surfaced explicitly. Bernard was reading the business section of the newspaper while Calantha prepared their French toast, Ella Fitzgerald playing softly in the background. Richardson's wife just had their second child, Bernard mentioned, his tone carefully casual. A boy this time. Calantha's hand stilled over the cinnamon shaker. Thomas Richardson was one of Bernard's board members, a man close to his age who had married a woman in her early 30s. She'd heard the whispers comparing her situation to Mrs. Richardson's, the expectations that naturally followed. "That's wonderful," she replied, keeping her voice light. "We should send them something." Bernard folded the newspaper, his movements deliberate. "Calantha," he said softly, "we need to talk about this." She turned to face him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared when he was struggling with something difficult. "About the Richardsons' baby. About our baby. About when we're going to start our family." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with expectation. Calantha moved to sit across from him at their breakfast bar, the French toast forgotten. "I thought we agreed to wait until my consulting firm was more established." "It's been 3 years," Bernard said, reaching for her hand. "Your firm is thriving. You've achieved so much. Don't you think it's time?" Calantha withdrew her hand slowly, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "I'm only 24, Bernard. My career's just taking off. Having a baby now would—" "Would what?" he interrupted, an edge creeping into his voice. "Hold you back? Is that what you think motherhood does?" "That's not what I meant," she said, feeling the conversation sliding sideways. "I just think we should wait a little longer, maybe in a year or two." "A year or two?" Bernard stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen. "Calantha, I'm 45. By the time our child graduates high school, I'll be in my 60s. I don't want to be an old father. I want to be able to play with my children, to have the energy to really be there for them." "And you will," she assured him, trying to bridge the growing distance between them. "You're in better shape than most 30-year-olds I know." But Bernard wasn't listening. Something had broken open inside him, releasing fears and pressures he'd been holding back. "The board has been asking questions about succession planning. The Ellison name has been on that company for 3 generations. We need an heir." Calantha felt as if she'd been slapped. "An heir? Is that what this is about? Continuing the Ellison dynasty?" "Of course not," he said quickly, but something in his eyes told her there was truth to her words. "It's about family, our family." The weeks that followed were tense, with unspoken words and growing pressure. Bernard began leaving fertility clinic brochures on her desk. Their friends, seemingly cued to the tension, started sharing their own parenthood stories whenever the couple visited. Even their housekeeper, Maria, took to sighing wistfully about how wonderful it would be to hear children's laughter in the penthouse. Calantha felt increasingly cornered. Her own desires and fears about motherhood became tangled with resistance to being pushed into something she wasn't ready for. She threw herself into work, taking on more clients, staying later at the office. Bernard responded by becoming more persistent, more demanding. The breaking point came after a dinner party at their home. They'd hosted several couples, including the Richardsons, who'd brought their new baby. Throughout the evening, Bernard had been watching Calantha with the infant, his expression a mixture of longing and frustration. After their guests left, as they were cleaning up, he said, "You're so natural with children. Why are you fighting this?" Calantha set down the wine glasses she was carrying with more force than necessary. "I'm not fighting anything. I'm just not ready." "Not ready?" Bernard's voice rose. "When will you be ready?" "When I'm 50, 60. This isn't just about you anymore, Calantha. This is about our future, about my legacy." "Your legacy," she interrupted, anger finally breaking through her careful control. "Is that all I am to you, a vessel for the next generation of Ellisons?" "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped. "You know that's not what I meant." Do I? She turned to face him fully. Because lately, it seems like all you care about is getting an heir. What about my dreams, my goals? Or do those not matter anymore now that you've decided it's time for me to become a mother? Your goals? Bernard laughed bitterly. I've supported every one of your goals. I've given you everything you could want. Is it so much to ask that you give me this one thing? The words hung between them like poison. Calantha felt tears burning in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Give you this one thing, as if carrying and raising a child is just some simple favor? As if my body and my life are yours to demand? That's not what I made an appointment, she cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. At the fertility clinic, for both of us. Standard testing, they said, to make sure everything's okay before we start trying. Bernard's face darkened. Testing? You think I need testing? It's standard procedure. The doctor said, I don't need any damn tests, he roared, slamming his hand on the counter. There's nothing wrong with me. If you're not ready, just say it. Don't try to make this about my fertility. Calantha stepped back, shocked by his vehemence. In 3 years of marriage, she'd never seen him lose control like this. Bernard, please, I'm just trying to be thorough, to make sure when we start trying, there is no when anymore, is there? He ran his hands through his hair, his frustration palpable. You're just stalling, using these tests as another excuse to delay. Well, I'm done waiting. I need to know, do you ever want children with me, Calantha? Or have you been lying this whole time? The accusation struck deep. How dare you? She whispered. How dare you question my honesty? I've never lied to you, not once. I want children someday, yes, but I want them when we're both ready, when we've been checked out medically, when it's too late for me, he interrupted. When I'm too old to be the father I want to be. Is that your plan? There is no plan, she shouted, finally losing her composure. There's just me, trying to make the biggest decision of my life, while you pressure me and manipulate me and make me feel like I'm nothing but a disappointment. Bernard recoiled, as if she'd struck him. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the kitchen island, the distance between them seeming to grow with each passing second. I think, he said finally, his voice cold and controlled, that you should stay in the guest room tonight. I think, she replied, gathering her strength, that I should stay with my aunt for a few days. We both need some space to think. He didn't try to stop her as she packed a bag, didn't speak as she called for a car, didn't move from his spot in the kitchen as she walked toward the door. Only when her hand was on the doorknob did he speak. If you walk out that door, he said, his voice rough with emotion, don't bother coming back. Calantha felt her heart shatter, but her voice remained steady. If that's how easily you can throw away 3 years of marriage, then maybe I shouldn't. The door closed behind her with a quiet click that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. As her car pulled away from their building, she finally let the tears fall, her wedding ring catching the streetlights as she twisted it on her finger. Neither of them slept that night. Bernard paced their penthouse like a caged animal, alternating between rage and regret. Calantha lay in her aunt's guest room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how their perfect love story had unraveled so quickly. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that this fracture would lead them down paths they never expected, to pain they never imagined, but ultimately to truths they never would have discovered any other way. Their love story wasn't ending, it was merely entering its most difficult chapter. The night. Everything shattered. The tension in the Ellison mansion had been simmering for weeks, but on that fateful night it finally reached a breaking point. Bernard's booming voice, usually calm and measured, now filled every corner of the expansive house, reverberating against the marble floors and high ceilings. Do you think I'm barren? His words, sharp and searing, cut through the air like a blade. Calantha stood frozen in the open concept kitchen, her slender frame dwarfed by the sheer grandeur of the room. She clutched a small card in her hand, the doctor's card, the simple white rectangle trembling between her fingers like a fragile piece of paper in a storm. Her breath hitched, her throat constricting as she struggled to form a coherent response. "Bernard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring silence that followed his accusation. "I just want us both to be checked, my love." Her words, though soft and earnest, were met with a glare so intense it made her step back. Bernard's whiskey-coloured eyes, which had once looked at her with warmth and admiration, now burned with a mix of anger, frustration, and something darker, wounded pride. "A man like me doesn't need to be checked," he thundered, slamming his hand on the pristine quartz countertop. The sound echoed, a violent punctuation to his statement. "How dare you even suggest that?" Calantha's heart ached at the sight of him. This wasn't the Bernard she knew, the man who had once held her hand through every challenge, who had whispered words of love and reassurance during their most difficult moments. This Bernard was a stranger, consumed by insecurities he refused to acknowledge, his ego and fear creating an impenetrable barrier between them. "I'm not suggesting anything," she tried again, her tone a careful blend of patience and desperation. "The doctor said it's standard. It's not about blame, Bernard. It's about understanding. Together." "Together?" He laughed bitterly, a hollow sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You mean you want to drag me into your doubts and insecurities? That's what this is about, isn't it? You're the one who doesn't want children, and now you're trying to make this about me." "No!" she exclaimed, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. "That's not it at all. Enough!" Bernard's shout silenced her mid-sentence, his voice echoing through the cavernous space like a judge's gavel. "I don't need tests. I don't need doctors. What I need is a wife who doesn't question me at every turn." Tears welled in Calantha's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. She straightened her shoulders, summoning the last remnants of her strength. "I am your wife," she said quietly, her voice trembling yet firm. "But I can't be the woman you need if we don't face this together. Please, Bernard, don't let your pride—" "My pride?" he interrupted, his voice dripping with incredulity. "You think this is about pride? You think I'm some shallow, egotistical man who can't handle the truth?" His words hung heavy in the air, their venom palpable. Calantha opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Bernard's face twisted in anger. "Get out!" he roared, his voice cracking with the force of his command. "I don't want to see your face again!" Calantha staggered back, as if physically struck by the force of his words. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. For a moment, she could only stare at him, her vision blurred by unshed tears. This was the man she had built a life with, the man she had trusted with her dreams, her vulnerabilities, her love, and now he was throwing it all away in a fit of rage. "Bernard," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't do this, please." But her words fell on deaf ears. Bernard turned away from her, his broad shoulders hunched as he gripped the edge of the countertop, his knuckles white with tension. He didn't respond, didn't look at her, didn't move. Calantha felt a cold wave of despair wash over her. She knew then that there was nothing more she could say, no words that could reach him in this state. Her pleas echoed through the grand, empty halls of the mansion, but they were met with silence. Finally, with trembling hands, she placed the doctor's card on the counter. It felt like a small, futile gesture, but it was all she could do. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the foyer, her footsteps soft and hesitant against the polished floors. As she reached the massive double doors, she paused, her hand resting on the brass handle. Part of her wanted to turn back, to fight for him, for them. But another part, the part that had been bruised and battered by his words, knew she couldn't, not tonight. "If you walk out that door," Bernard's voice called out behind her, cold and unyielding, "don't bother coming back." The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his over the expanse of the room. His face was shadowed, his expression unreadable, but she could see the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands still gripped the counter as if it were the only thing grounding him. "If that's how easily you can throw away 3 years of marriage," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks, "then maybe I shouldn't come back." With that, she opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. The weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders as she walked down the driveway, the Ellison mansion looming behind her like a dark, foreboding castle. As she climbed into the waiting car, the driver glanced at her in concern, but she waved him off, unable to speak. As the car pulled away, Calantha's mind replayed the night's events in a relentless loop. The sound of Bernard's voice, the look in his eyes, the venom in his words, they were etched into her memory, cutting deeper with each passing second. She clutched her wedding ring tightly, the cool metal biting into her palm, a painful reminder of what she was leaving behind. Back at the mansion, Bernard stood alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He stared at the doctor's card on the counter, his vision blurring as anger gave way to something far more devastating, regret. But it was too late. The door had closed, the night had shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. London's embrace, London, had always been a city of contrasts, its vibrant streets bursting with life even under perpetually grey skies. For Calantha, however, the city's dull, overcast canopy mirrored the haze that had settled over her heart. It had been months since she'd left Bernard, and each day felt like an uphill climb, a relentless struggle to rebuild her life from the shattered pieces of their once-perfect love story. Her small flat in Bloomsbury, with its narrow rooms and creaky floorboards, was a stark contrast to the sprawling luxury of the Ellison mansion. Yet, it was hers. The little space, with its second-hand furniture and hastily hung curtains, carried a warmth she desperately needed. She spent her days consulting for local businesses, her natural marketing genius proving invaluable even in a foreign market. But her nights were lonelier than she cared to admit. No amount of work could fully fill the void left by Bernard's absence. She wandered the cobblestone streets of London in the evenings, her coat pulled tight against the chill. The city buzzed with life, couples strolling hand in hand, families laughing over dinners at street-side cafes, musicians playing soulful tunes at every corner. Calantha would pause occasionally to watch, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and hope. She told herself that this too would pass, that one day the ache would fade. And then the call came. It was a crisp autumn morning when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The name on the screen made her pause. Celine Thompson, her best friend, her rock, the one who had stood by her side through every trial, every triumph. The voice on the other end, however, wasn't Celine's. "Ms. Ione," a sombre voice said, "this is Dr. Patel from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Calantha's breath caught in her throat as the doctor explained. Celine, her vibrant and fearless friend, had died during childbirth, a complication no one had foreseen, the doctor said. She left behind 3 premature but otherwise healthy babies, 2 girls and a boy. The words hit Calantha like a freight train. She gripped the counter for support, her knees threatening to buckle. Celine was gone. The woman who had been her lifeline during the darkest days of her marriage, the one who had celebrated her successes and mourned her failures, was gone. The loss was incomprehensible. Her family, Calantha's voice trembled as she spoke. Who's taking care of the babies? There was a pause on the other end. Celine listed you as their godmother and primary guardian in her will. The room spun. She sat down heavily, the weight of the revelation settling over her. Me? She always spoke so highly of you, the doctor continued gently. She trusted you more than anyone. That evening, Calantha sat in the hospital's neonatal unit, staring through the glass at the 3 tiny lives that had just entered the world. They were so small, swaddled in pastel blankets, their chests rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of new life. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she pressed her hand against the glass. Celine, she whispered, her voice breaking. How could you leave them? How could you leave me? The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, late-night feedings, and a crash course in motherhood. Calantha moved the babies into her tiny flat, transforming the living room into a makeshift nursery. She learned to navigate London's bustling streets with a double stroller and a sling, the triplets drawing curious smiles and whispers wherever she went. The nights were the hardest. The baby's cries echoed through the flat, piercing her exhausted mind. Yet, in the quiet moments, when she held one of them close, their tiny fingers wrapping around hers, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Slowly, her grief began to shift. The ache of losing Celine didn't lessen, but it found a companion in the overwhelming love she felt for these children. The triplets, Celine, Clara and Caleb, named in honor of their mother, became the center of Calantha's world. Every giggle, every milestone, every first word filled the emptiness Bernard had left behind. She threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she had once reserved for her career, her days a blur of bottle sterilizers, diaper changes, and bedtime stories. The first time all 3 babies laughed simultaneously, Calantha found herself laughing with them, tears of joy streaming down her face. It was in these moments, surrounded by tiny giggles and soft coos, that she realized how much she had gained even amidst her losses. Her work, too, took on a new dimension. Inspired by her own experiences, Calantha began consulting for organizations focused on maternal health and childcare. She shared Celine's story, advocating for better healthcare policies and resources for mothers. Her passion and eloquence drew attention, and soon her name became synonymous with both innovation and compassion. London embraced her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The small community she built around her, other mothers at the park, colleagues who admired her tenacity, neighbors who offered to babysit, became her extended family. And though she missed Bernard in quiet, unguarded moments, she found herself looking forward instead of back. One evening, as she sat in the nursery rocking Caleb to sleep, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked tired, yes, but also content, fulfilled. She smiled softly, kissing Caleb's forehead before laying him in his crib. "Thank you, Celine," she whispered into the quiet room, "for trusting me, for giving me a purpose when I thought I'd lost everything." The triplets' laughter, their tiny hands reaching for her, their sleepy sighs as they nestled against her, these became her anchors. And as the seasons changed and the grey skies of London gave way to the occasional burst of sunshine, Calantha found herself smiling more often, her heart slowly healing. The void Bernard had left was still there, but it no longer consumed her. It had been filled with something greater, the love of 3 little lives that had become her everything. London, with its grey skies and bustling streets, had become her sanctuary. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Calantha believed she could build a future not defined by what she had lost, but by the love she had found. 5 years later, the autumn air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of children's laughter. In Hyde Park, London's sprawling green heart. Families gathered under the warm embrace of late afternoon sunlight. Dogs bounded across the grass, their joyous barks blending with the rustle of leaves, while couples strolled hand in hand along the Serpentine. For Bernard Ellison, however, the world seemed muted, its vibrancy dulled by the weight of 5 long years. He had come to London on business, as he often did now. His visits to the city, once rare, had become a quiet pilgrimage of sorts, a way to feel closer to her, even if he didn't fully understand why. Today, he'd wandered into Hyde Park, seeking a reprieve from his thoughts. He'd been walking aimlessly, his mind adrift in memories of Calantha, her laughter, her touch, the fire in her eyes, when she was passionate about something, memories that had haunted him every day since she left. He was about to turn toward the exit when a sound froze him in place. Laughter, high, melodic, and unmistakably familiar. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes found her. Calantha. She was sitting on a picnic blanket beneath a sprawling oak tree, her face illuminated by the golden light filtering through its branches. Time had only deepened her beauty. Her hair, now styled in soft curls, framed her face perfectly, and her skin glowed with a vitality he hadn't seen in years. She wore a simple yet elegant sweater and jeans, her outfit as unassuming as it was radiant. But what truly captured his attention was the scene around her. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, danced in circles around her, their laughter ringing out like music. The boy, with a mop of curly hair and bright, mischievous eyes, clutched a kite string as it fluttered in the breeze. One of the girls was braiding daisies into the other's hair, her tiny hands moving with careful precision. Calantha's smile, warm and unguarded, was the kind he hadn't seen since before their marriage began to crack. She looked at the children with a love so profound it made Bernard's chest ache. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The sight of her, of them, hit him with the force of a freight train. He stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, unsure of what to do. 5 years. 5 years of regret, of searching, of crying himself to sleep in an empty penthouse that had once felt alive with her presence. 5 years of building a life that felt hollow without her. And now, here she was, as if plucked from his dreams. "Daddy, look!" The boy's voice jolted Bernard from his thoughts. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought the boy was speaking to him. But then another figure emerged from the trees, a man tall and broad-shouldered, carrying a basket of sandwiches and drinks. The boy ran to him, and the man ruffled his hair affectionately, laughing as the girls joined in, clamoring for attention. Bernard watched, rooted to the spot, as the man leaned down to kiss Calantha on the cheek. The world tilted. Bernard felt as though the ground beneath him had given way. He gripped the iron railing of the path, his knuckles white, as a single thought pounded in his mind. She's moved on. His heart twisted painfully, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. He told himself he should leave, that he had no right to intrude on her life, and yet he stayed, watching, waiting, hoping. As if sensing his presence, Calantha's eyes lifted, scanning the park until they locked onto his. Her smile faltered, her eyes widened. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The children's laughter and the murmur of the park seemed to fade into nothingness as they stared at each other, 1,000 emotions passing between them in silence. Bernard took a hesitant step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply stood there, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years, his gaze pleading for something he couldn't articulate. Calantha's expression shifted. Surprise gave way to something softer, more complicated. She rose slowly, brushing off her jeans. Her steps toward him were cautious, deliberate, as if crossing a fragile bridge that could collapse at any moment. "Bernard," she said softly when they were close enough to speak. The sound of his name on her lips was both a balm and a wound. Calantha. His voice was rough, laden with years of unsaid words. He searched her face, desperate to find some trace of the love they once shared. It's been a long time. Yes, she replied, her tone guarded yet not unkind. It has. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. Bernard's gaze flickered to the children, who were now playing with the man near the tree. His stomach churned with jealousy and grief. There. Yours? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Calantha hesitated, then nodded. Celine, Clara and Caleb, they're my late best friend's children. I adopted them after she passed. Relief flooded him, followed quickly by shame at his assumption. I didn't know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry, Calantha, for your loss. Thank you, she replied, her eyes softening. They've been my world ever since. And him? Bernard gestured toward the man, unable to keep the bitterness from his tone. That's Ian, Calantha said simply. He's a friend. He's been helping me with the children. Bernard's heart leapt at her words, though he tried to hide it. Calantha, he began, stepping closer. I've spent 5 years searching for you, regretting every mistake I made. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but stop. Her voice, though gentle, carried a firmness that silenced him. She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and resolve. Bernard, I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Too much has happened. I've built a life here. I don't want to go back, he said quickly. I want to move forward. With you. With them. He gestured toward the children. I'll do whatever it takes to prove I've changed, to show you that I can be the man you deserve. Calantha's gaze softened further, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's not that simple. I know, he said, his voice breaking, but please, give me a chance. Let me show you. Before she could respond, one of the girls ran up, her daisy crown slightly askew. Mama, who's that? She asked, looking up at Bernard with wide, curious eyes. Calantha knelt to fix the crown, her movements slow and deliberate. When she looked up at Bernard again, something in her expression had shifted. A small smile played at the corners of her lips. Someone from my past, she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. Bernard's heart swelled with hope. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was a start. And for now, that was enough. 2 weeks of persistence. The first time he appeared, it was raining. A soft drizzle blanketed London's streets, leaving the city damp and glistening under grey skies. Calantha, exiting her office after a long day of meetings, nearly collided with him. Bernard stood on the sidewalk, a sleek black umbrella in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. The rain blurred the sharp edges of his tailored coat and softened the storm in his whiskey-coloured eyes. I thought you might need this, he said quietly, holding out the cup. Calantha stopped in her tracks. Her heart leapt in a way that infuriated her. She looked at him, taking in the lines on his face that seemed deeper than before, the faint shadow of silver creeping further into his temples. He was older now, but the sight of him was no less arresting. I don't drink that anymore, she said coolly, stepping past him into the waiting cab without sparing him a second glance. But Bernard wasn't deterred. The next day he was there again. This time he stood outside the small cafe where she usually stopped for a mid-morning break. He had no coffee this time, just a single daisy in hand, the petals faintly damp with dew. It reminded me of you, he said as she passed. She didn't stop, but out of the corner of her eye, she saw him place the flower on the table where she usually sat. When she returned, an hour later, the flower was still there, its simple beauty an unspoken testament to his persistence. By the end of the first week, Bernard had stationed himself like a quiet sentinel at the periphery of her life. He seemed to know her routines, her favorite haunts, the places she frequented when she needed solitude or inspiration. She found him waiting outside her children's school one afternoon, though he kept his distance, not daring to approach as she gathered the triplets into her arms. Another time, she spotted him browsing the shelves of her favorite bookstore, holding a stack of novels by Zadie Smith and Toni Morrison. "What are you doing here, Bernard?" she asked, her tone sharp despite the flutter in her chest. "I thought you might like these," he said, his voice soft. He handed her the books, and though she didn't take them, she didn't leave either. For a moment they stood there, the air between them charged with words unsaid. Then, with a sigh, she turned and walked away, her steps heavy with the weight of conflicted emotions. By the second week, his persistence had taken on a rhythm. Mornings brought flowers or notes left in places she couldn't ignore, the steps outside her office, the bench where she sat during her lunch breaks, the window ledge of her favorite cafe. Each note was a piece of his heart laid bare. "I was wrong. Our home is empty without you. You taught me what love is, and I forgot how to show it. I miss your laugh. I miss you." Evenings brought small gestures that tugged at her resolve. He once appeared outside her building holding a stack of containers filled with her favorite Ghanaian dishes, which he must have painstakingly researched to prepare himself. She didn't open the door, but when she peeked through the curtains, she saw him carefully placing the containers on the steps before walking away. She spent that night eating his jollof rice and weeping silently, the flavors a bittersweet reminder of the man she had once loved. Her children, too, began to notice. One morning, Clara pointed out a small bouquet of daisies left on their doorstep. "Who's leaving us flowers, Mama?" she asked innocently, her eyes wide with curiosity. "No one important," Calantha replied quickly, though her voice wavered. But Bernard's persistence wasn't just in gifts or notes. He found ways to remind her of the man he had been, the man who had once listened to her dreams and held her when she cried. One evening, she attended a lecture at a local university, only to find him sitting quietly in the back row, his presence unobtrusive but impossible to ignore. When she confronted him afterward, her anger barely masked the tremor in her voice. "You can't keep showing up like this, Bernard," she said, her arms crossed defensively. "I'll stop," he replied earnestly, "if you can look me in the eye and tell me you feel nothing, that you don't miss me at all." Her silence spoke volumes, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of an answer. Turning on her heel, she left, her heart pounding furiously in her chest. The next day, he left a letter in her mailbox. Not just a note, but a heartfelt, handwritten letter that stretched across 3 pages. In it, he poured out everything he had been unable to say aloud, his regrets, his mistakes, his love for her that had never waned. "Calantha," he wrote, "I was a fool to let my pride destroy what we had. I didn't just lose a wife that night, I lost my best friend, my partner, my reason for believing in something greater than myself. I've spent 5 years learning what it means to truly love someone, and every lesson has led me back to you. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope for a chance to show you that I've changed, that I'm the man you always deserved." She read the letter twice, then a third time, her tears smudging the ink. For the first time, she felt the walls she had so carefully built begin to crack. Bernard's persistence wasn't just about winning her back. It was about proving he had grown, that he understood the depth of the pain he had caused and was willing to do the work to heal it. On the final day of his 2-week campaign, Bernard took a different approach. Instead of waiting for her outside her office or leaving another note, he arranged for a private concert in the park near her home. A small jazz quartet played her favorite John Coltrane pieces beneath the evening sky, their soulful melodies drifting through the cool air. As she approached, drawn by the music, she found him standing at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't holding flowers or gifts this time. Instead, he stood there with his hands in his pockets, his expression open and vulnerable. "I don't deserve you," he said when she finally approached him, "but I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that I've learned from my mistakes, whether you give me another chance or not." Calantha stared at him, her heart pounding. For weeks she had resisted him, turned her back on his gestures, ignored the pangs of longing he evoked. But now, standing here with the music swirling around them, she felt her resolve falter. "Bernard," she began, her voice soft yet firm, "this isn't about grand gestures or notes or flowers. It's about trust, and that takes more than 2 weeks to rebuild." "I know," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers, "but I'm willing to wait. For as long as it takes." In that moment, Calantha saw the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Not the prideful CEO or the man consumed by his own insecurities, but the Bernard who had once danced with her in their kitchen, who had read poetry to her by the fire, who had made her believe in love. She didn't give him an answer that night, but for the first time she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the bridge he was building could be strong enough to carry them both back to each other. The bridge of second chances. The air on Tower Bridge was crisp, carrying the mingled scents of the Thames below and the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. The city bustled as usual, red double-decker buses rumbling past and tourists snapping photos of the iconic skyline. But for Bernard Ellison, none of it registered. Standing at the center of the bridge, he clutched a letter in his trembling hands, his last desperate attempt to reach her. The pages of the letter had become worn, creased from the countless times he had folded and unfolded them. Each word he had written felt like a piece of his soul laid bare, stripped of pride, stripped of pretense. It was a confession years in the making, born of regret, shame, and an unyielding love that refused to fade. His neatly inked script bled onto the page in places where his tears had fallen during the late-night hours spent drafting it. For years, he had carried the burden of his discovery, a revelation that had both crushed him and brought clarity to his past mistakes. The visit to the doctor, his own private attempt to uncover the truth he had been too proud to face years ago, had revealed what he had feared most: infertility. He had spent nights agonizing over the irony of his accusations toward Calantha, the anger he had unjustly hurled at her, the relationship he had let crumble under the weight of his own ego. His words in that final argument, spoken in anger and fear, haunted him. "Do you think I'm barren?" The question had been a cruel projection, an unacknowledged fear of his own inadequacies. And so this letter had become his confession. It was his attempt to give her the truth, to show her that he had grown, that he had faced his flaws and found the courage to own them. "Calantha," it began, "I need you to know what I could never admit before. The fault was mine, not yours. My fear, my pride, my refusal to see what truly mattered. It cost us everything. The truth is I was afraid of losing you, afraid of being less than the man I thought I should be. I visited the doctor after you left, and they confirmed what I had refused to consider. I cannot have children. The irony of my accusations cuts deeper than I can express. You deserved honesty, and instead I gave you pain." As the wind tugged at the edges of the pages, Bernard tightened his grip. The words continued. "These 5 years have been an endless search. For you, for meaning, for forgiveness. I found none of it without you. I have spent every moment wishing I could turn back time, but I know that's impossible. All I can do is ask for one thing: a chance to be better, a chance to build a life with you. Whatever that may look like, you are my family, Calantha, you always were. He had debated delivering the letter in person or leaving it at her doorstep, but something about this bridge, this iconic meeting point of past and present, this symbol of connection and strength, had drawn him here. Now, with the sun beginning to set, its golden rays painting the river in hues of amber and crimson, Bernard stood alone, waiting. His fingers tightened around the letter, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. What if she didn't come? He had asked her to meet him here in a final note left on her doorstep the previous evening. No grand gestures, no flowers, just a simple invitation. Tower Bridge at sunset. Please. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as he scanned the horizon, his heart sinking with every passing minute. The rhythmic pulse of footsteps on the bridge blurred into a cacophony of sound, none of them hers, and then, like a whispered prayer answered, he heard it. Bernard. One word. One single word that froze him in place, that shattered his despair and rebuilt it as hope. He turned slowly, almost afraid to believe it was real. There she was. Calantha stood a few paces away, her silhouette framed by the fiery hues of the setting sun. She looked radiant, her natural curls catching the light like a halo, her eyes reflecting the deep, warm hues of the dusk. She wore a simple trench coat, her hands tucked into the pockets as if to guard against the evening chill, but her gaze was unguarded, open and searching. Calantha, he breathed, his voice trembling with emotion. He stepped toward her, holding the letter out like an offering. I wrote this for you. It's everything I should have said years ago. Everything I've wanted to say since. She didn't take the letter right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, as though she were trying to read his soul. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. I don't need the letter, she said softly, finally breaking the quiet. Just tell me, Bernard. Tell me why you're here. He swallowed hard, his chest tight with the weight of everything he wanted to say. I'm here because I can't live without you, he said, his voice raw. Because I was a fool to let you go. Because these 5 years have been the loneliest of my life. I see you with those children, and I see everything I've ever wanted. A family, a home, a purpose. I know I don't deserve it, but I... Stop, she interrupted, holding up a hand. Her eyes were glistening, though her expression remained steady. Do you even understand what you're asking, Bernard? You left me broken. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. I had to find strength I didn't know I had, for myself and for those children. And now you want to walk back into my life as if... No, he cut in, his tone firm but pleading. Not as if nothing happened. I know what I did, Calantha. I know the pain I caused. And I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to let me help carry the weight. To let me be the man you need, even if it takes the rest of my life to prove I can be. Her lips parted as if to respond, but she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the letter in his hand. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against his. She unfolded the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the words in the golden light. When she looked up again, her expression had softened, though her tears now flowed freely. Bernard, she whispered, her voice breaking, I don't know if I can trust you again, but I want to try. It was all he needed, a chance, a sliver of hope. He stepped closer, his heart pounding as he reached for her hand. Then let's start with this, he said softly, one step at a time, together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of deep purple and gold, they stood on the bridge, their hands intertwined. It was a fragile beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless, a bridge of second chances, built on love, regret, and the courage to try again. Love's return. The whispers began months before the invitations were sent. Bernard Ellison, the titan of industry who had vanished from Washington's social scene for years, was remarrying. And not just anyone, he was remarrying her. Calantha Ione, now a celebrated figure in her own right, whose story of resilience and motherhood had become a quiet inspiration to many. Together, their reunion was not just a rekindling of romance, but a triumph of love over pride, patience over anger, and hope over despair. This time their wedding was different. Gone were the towering flower arrangements and the gilded grandeur of their first ceremony. In its place was something simple yet profound, a celebration of truth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that only deepens with scars. The ceremony took place on a cool autumn afternoon in the garden of their family home in the Berkshires. The trees, dressed in shades of amber and crimson, formed a natural cathedral overhead. Rows of simple wooden chairs lined the aisle, where Calantha walked, barefoot this time, her flowing ivory dress trailing softly behind her. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked by the children that very morning. As she approached, Bernard stood waiting beneath an arch entwined with ivy and daisies, a nod to the flowers that had symbolized his persistence. His face, lined with age and wisdom, glowed with a quiet joy that couldn't be contained. Calantha's smile was radiant, her tears already falling as she reached him. Around them, the laughter and whispers of their 5 children filled the air. Celine, Clara, and Caleb, now 10, served as flower girls and ring-bearer, their infectious energy bringing warmth to the cool day. Their 2 youngest children, Benjamin, 4, and Rose, 3, clung to their older siblings, their bright eyes reflecting the joy of the moment. As the officiant spoke, there was no need for elaborate vows. Bernard and Calantha had already made the promises that mattered most in the quiet moments of their reunion, in the hard conversations that followed, and in the days spent rebuilding trust, one gesture at a time. "I don't just love you," Bernard said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I admire you. I respect you. And every day, I am grateful that you gave me the chance to earn your forgiveness. Today isn't the start of our story. It's the celebration of everything we've overcome to get here." Calantha's voice was soft but unwavering. "I once thought love was about perfection," she said, her gaze locked on his. "But I've learned it's about persistence, about showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. You've taught me that, Bernard, and together we've built something stronger than I ever dreamed possible." The kiss that followed was met with cheers, applause, and a few tears from those gathered. But the real celebration began after the ceremony. Tables were arranged under twinkling string lights, and instead of a formal dinner, guests were treated to a feast that blended their worlds. Soul food from Calantha's childhood, classic French dishes Bernard had always loved, and an array of desserts made with the help of their children. Music filled the air, a mix of jazz, R&B, and the occasional upbeat pop song requested by the Triplets. Bernard danced with each of his daughters, twirling them under the lights until they dissolved into giggles. Calantha found herself swept into a dance with Caleb, who declared with the utmost seriousness that he was the man of the house, whenever Bernard wasn't around. As the evening deepened, friends and family took turns sharing stories. Ian, who had become a steadfast friend to both Bernard and Calantha, spoke of watching their journey from the sidelines. "This isn't just a love story," he said, raising his glass. "It's a lesson in resilience, in humility, and in the belief that love, when true, always finds its way home." The years that followed proved him right. Bernard and Calantha's life together was far from perfect, but it was deeply fulfilling. They continued to split their time between Washington and London, their careers evolving alongside their family. Calantha's consulting firm grew into a global powerhouse, while Bernard transitioned into philanthropy, focusing on causes close to their hearts: maternal health, education, and environmental sustainability. Their children thrived. The triplets, inseparable even as they grew older, carried with them the adventurous spirit of their mother and the quiet determination of their father. Benjamin, with his sharp mind and love of books, became a constant source of joy, while Rose, a whirlwind of energy and creativity, kept the entire family on their toes. 20 years after their second wedding, the Ellison family gathered once again, this time to celebrate Bernard and Calantha's anniversary. The triplets, now adults with lives of their own, returned with their partners and stories of their adventures. Benjamin and Rose, teenagers bursting with potential, planned a surprise for their parents, an album filled with photos, letters, and memories spanning the decades. That evening, as the sun set over the same Berkshire's garden where they had said their vows, Bernard and Calantha sat surrounded by their family. The lines on their faces told a story of love that had endured, through heartbreak, through growth, through every joy and challenge life had thrown their way. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Bernard asked, his arm draped around Calantha as they watched their children laughing together. "All the time," she replied, leaning into him. "And I wouldn't change a thing. Every mistake, every tear, every hard moment, it brought us here." Their hands, intertwined, still fit together perfectly after all these years. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Bernard kissed her forehead, his heart full in a way he hadn't known was possible before her. Their love story, once broken, had been rewritten. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that they both knew was far better. For in the end, their family of 7, bound not by blood alone but by choice, forgiveness, and unyielding love, stood as a testament to the idea that true love, when nurtured, could withstand anything. It could falter but never fail, and it could always, always find its way home. Message for women, inspired by this story. To every woman who has faced betrayal, stood alone in the shadows of heartbreak, or is searching for a love that feels true, know this: your worth is not defined by someone else's actions, and your strength is immeasurable. Like Calantha, you are capable of rebuilding, of finding purpose in yourself, and of creating a life filled with love, even if it doesn't come in the form you initially envisioned. When someone walks away or fails to see your value, it's not a reflection of your worth, but of their inability to recognize it. In those moments, remember that being alone does not mean being unworthy. It means you have the opportunity to rediscover yourself, to pour your energy into your passions, your dreams, and the people who truly cherish you. True love, whether romantic, familial, or found within your own heart, doesn't diminish you. It lifts you, supports you, and grows with you. And when it arrives, it comes with patience, respect, and an unwavering commitment to your happiness. Motivation. If you've been betrayed, let the pain be your fuel, not your anchor. Rise stronger, not for someone else, but for yourself. If you're alone, remember, solitude is not emptiness. It's a fertile ground for growth, self-discovery, and the planting of dreams. And if you're searching for true love, don't settle for anything less than a love that honors your strength, nurtures your soul, and walks beside you through every storm. Calantha's journey reminds us that life's setbacks, no matter how devastating, are not endings. They are opportunities for reinvention. It is in the moments when you feel most broken that you have the chance to rebuild yourself into someone even more extraordinary. You are not defined by the love you've lost, but by the love you find within yourself, in the laughter of children, in the pursuit of your dreams, and, when the time is right, in the arms of someone who truly deserves you. Enjoyed this story? Subscribe now for more inspiring tales and heartfelt journeys.